1. The quiet loneliness no one saw. She heard the words, "I love you," almost every day. But somehow, she had never felt more alone. Some stories don't begin with betrayal. They don't begin with shouting, or slammed doors, or dramatic endings. Some stories begin with something far quieter. A silence. The kind that slowly grows between two people who still say they love each other. Claire used to believe she was lucky. Daniel was the kind of man people admired without question. He was calm, successful, thoughtful in ways that impressed everyone around him. He remembered birthdays. He opened doors. He spoke gently in conversations. From the outside, their relationship looked steady, almost effortless. Friends often told her the same thing. "You're so lucky to have someone like him." And every time she heard that, Claire would smile. Not because it was true, but because she didn't know how to explain the strange feeling she carried inside. Because nothing was obviously wrong. Daniel never yelled. He never insulted her. He never disappeared for days. And yet, there were moments, small ones at first, when Claire felt something she couldn't quite name. Moments when she spoke about her day, and Daniel nodded politely, but his eyes seemed somewhere else. Moments when she tried to talk about something deeper, something personal, and the conversation quietly drifted away. Not rejected, just redirected. And the strange thing was, Daniel still said the words, "I love you." He said them easily, almost naturally, like a sentence that had always been there. But slowly, Claire began to notice something unsettling. Those words never seemed to arrive with presence. They floated in the air, but never truly landed. At night, when they sat together in the same room, Claire sometimes felt a quiet distance she couldn't measure. Not physical distance. Something harder to describe. The feeling of being beside someone, while somehow still being alone. At first she blamed herself. Maybe she was too sensitive. Maybe she was expecting too much. Maybe love simply felt different after a while. So she stayed quiet. She didn't push. She didn't ask too many questions. Because Daniel was kind. And kindness, she thought, should be enough. But loneliness has a strange way of growing in quiet spaces. And Claire had no idea yet that what she was feeling was not confusion. It was the first sign of something much deeper. Before we continue this story, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast, where we explore the quiet truths about love, loss, and the emotions people rarely speak about. Because sometimes, the most important stories are the ones hidden in silence. 2. The kind man everyone admired. Daniel was the kind of man people trusted almost instantly. He didn't need to demand attention. He carried the kind of calm that made other people relax around him. His voice was measured, his smile was restrained, his movements were never rushed. Everything about him suggested control, maturity, and quiet strength. When he entered a room, he didn't dominate it. He softened it. He knew how to listen at the right moments. He knew how to ask polite questions. He remembered small details that made people feel seen. A coworker's sick mother, a friend's job interview, a waitress who looked overwhelmed near the end of a long shift. He noticed things. And because he noticed things, people believed he must be deeply caring. Claire used to believe that too. At dinners with friends, Daniel was the man everyone praised after they left. The one women called rare. The one men respected without saying much. He never interrupted, never bragged, never acted insecure. He had the kind of self-possession that made everyone assume he would be safe to love. And in many ways, he was safe. That was what made it so hard to explain. He was never cruel. Never explosive. Never openly dismissive. If someone had asked Claire whether Daniel was a good man, she would have said yes without hesitation. Because he was. That was the problem. There was nothing obvious to point at. No betrayal dramatic enough to name. No visible wound she could show the world and say, "There, that's why I'm hurting." From the outside, Daniel looked like love in its most respectable form. He sent thoughtful messages. He showed up on time. He made practical gestures that most women would have envied. If Claire was cold, he brought her a coat. If she forgot to eat, he ordered food. If her car made a strange sound, he booked the appointment before she even asked. He was reliable in all the ways that could be seen. But love is not only built in what can be seen. That was the part no one understood. No one saw what happened in the quieter moments. When Claire tried to stay in a conversation just a little longer, hoping he would open up. When she searched his face after saying something vulnerable, waiting for a flicker of emotional recognition that never fully arrived. Daniel always responded well enough to appear loving. But somehow, never deeply enough to make her feel met. He could solve problems. He could provide comfort. He could say the right words. But there was a distance inside him that no kindness seemed able to cross. And because he was so decent, Claire began turning the confusion inward. Maybe the emptiness she felt was unfair. Maybe she was overlooking all the good. Maybe some people were simply less expressive, and love required maturity, not need. So she adjusted. She lowered the volume of her longing, softened her questions, translated her sadness into silence. Because how do you explain being lonely with someone everyone else calls wonderful? How do you name the ache of being cared for, but not truly reached? And worst of all, how do you admit that the man everyone admires is slowly teaching you not to trust your own emotional hunger? Claire didn't have those words yet. All she knew was this. The world looked at Daniel and saw kindness. But she was beginning to wonder whether kindness, without emotional presence, could still leave a person starving. 3. Love that only existed in words. Daniel said the words often. I love you. Sometimes when they were leaving the apartment in the morning. Sometimes when they hung up the phone at night. Sometimes in the quiet pauses between ordinary conversations. He said it naturally, almost effortlessly. The words seemed to come to him the way breathing does, automatic. Familiar, unquestioned. And for a long time, Claire held onto those words as proof. Proof that what she felt, the strange loneliness creeping into their relationship, must only be temporary. Because how could someone say I love you so easily and not mean it? But slowly, Claire began noticing something subtle. Something that was difficult to explain, even to herself. The words were always there. But the feeling behind them was harder to find. When Claire talked about something joyful, something that mattered to her, Daniel would smile and nod. He listened politely, sometimes even repeating her words back to her. Yet his responses felt rehearsed. Not cold. Not dismissive. Just slightly removed, as if he were observing the moment rather than living inside it. At first, Claire told herself that everyone loved differently. Some people were expressive. Some people were quiet. Maybe Daniel's love simply lived in actions instead of emotions. And to be fair, he did show care in practical ways. If Claire had a long day at work, Daniel ordered dinner without being asked. If she mentioned feeling tired, he reminded her to rest. If she forgot something important, he calmly solved the problem. On paper, it looked like love. But something inside Claire kept whispering that something was missing. Because love, real love, does more than manage life's details. It reaches toward you. It leans in. It recognizes the invisible world inside another person. Claire began to notice the moments when she tried to open that invisible world. Small moments. Moments when she spoke about fears she rarely admitted aloud. Moments when she shared memories that still carried quiet sadness. And in those moments, Daniel did what he always did. He responded kindly. But never deeply. He would offer advice. Or gently shift the topic towards something practical. Don't worry about it, he would say. You're thinking too much. The conversation would move forward. But Claire felt something inside her fall quiet. Not because Daniel had rejected her, but because he had never truly entered the emotional space she had opened. And that difference, so small on the surface, began to matter more and more. Because words like I love you can mean many things. Sometimes they mean passion. Sometimes they mean commitment. And sometimes they simply mean habit. Claire started wondering which one Daniel meant. Because every time he said the words, they floated gently between them. Soft, familiar, comfortable. But somehow, they never quite touched the place in her heart that still waited to feel seen. 4. The invisible wall. It wasn't the kind of distance most people would notice. There were no slammed doors. No cold silences stretched across entire days. No obvious rejection sharp enough to leave a visible scar. What Claire felt was harder to explain than that. It was the feeling of standing very close to someone, and somehow never arriving. The closer she tried to get to Daniel emotionally, the more she sensed something unseen between them. Not anger. Not cruelty. Not even resistance in the usual sense. Just a wall. Invisible. Smooth. Always there. At first, she thought she was imagining it. Because Daniel never acted like a man with something to hide. He answered questions. He listened when she spoke. He never told her to stop being emotional. He never mocked her for wanting more connection. And that was what made it so disorienting. He didn't push her away. He simply never let her all the way in. There were moments when Claire felt almost certain she could reach him. Late at night, when the world was quieter. In the car after long dinners. In those soft in-between moments when people usually say what they truly feel. She would ask something gentle. Not demanding, not confrontational. Are you happy? Do you ever feel alone, even when people are around? What do you think love is supposed to feel like after a while? Daniel never grew defensive. He would pause. Sometimes even smile, as if appreciating the depth of the question. Then he would answer in a way that sounded thoughtful, without ever becoming vulnerable. I think happiness changes as you get older. Everyone feels lonely sometimes. Love is stability, trust, choosing someone every day. His words were not wrong. That was the strange part. They were mature, reasonable, even comforting in a distant kind of way. But Claire could feel the difference between a true answer and a polished one. A true answer lets you step inside someone. A polished answer lets you admire the door, while it stays closed. And Daniel was very good at speaking from behind closed doors. The more Claire noticed it, the more it unsettled her. She began to realize that Daniel could talk about emotions in general, but almost never from inside his own. He could explain pain. He could describe love. He could even sound wise about fear, loss, and connection. But when a conversation moved too close to something personal, something real shifted in him. Not visibly. That was what made it so difficult to name. It happened in the smallest ways. A slight change in posture. A softer but more controlled tone. A response that sounded complete, yet somehow ended the conversation instead of deepening it. Claire started leaving those moments with the same quiet ache. Not wounded enough to protest. Not satisfied enough to rest. Just suspended. As if she kept reaching for something warm behind glass. And over time, the wall began to do more than frustrate her. It began to change her. She started rehearsing her feelings before speaking. Editing them. Making them smaller, easier, less likely to disappear into that invisible space between them. Because every time she opened a door inside herself, and found his still closed, something in her began to close too. Not all at once. Just slowly enough that no one but Claire could feel it happening. 5. Kind, but never close. Daniel was, without question, a kind man. Not the loud, dramatic kind of kindness people perform in front of others. His was quieter, subtle, consistent. He opened doors without thinking about it. He noticed when Claire looked tired. He remembered the small things people often forget. If she mentioned she hadn't eaten all day, dinner would quietly appear on the table an hour later. If she had a stressful week, he would suggest a calm evening at home. If something practical went wrong in her life, Daniel solved it quickly and without complaint. From the outside, it looked like the kind of relationship many people hoped for. Reliable, stable, peaceful. And Claire did feel cared for. That was never the problem. What confused her was something harder to name. Daniel was always gentle with her, but he was rarely close to her. The difference was subtle, but once she began to notice it, she couldn't ignore it anymore. Kindness took care of her comfort. Closeness touched her inner world. Daniel excelled at the first, but the second always seemed to remain just out of reach. There were moments when Claire longed for something very simple. Not advice. Not solutions. Not calm reassurance. Just presence. The kind of presence that says, "I'm here with you in this feeling." But when Claire expressed sadness or uncertainty, Daniel's instinct was always the same. He tried to fix it. "You're going to be fine," he would say gently. "Don't let it get to you. You're stronger than you think." The words were supportive, even loving, in a certain way. But they carried a quiet message Claire couldn't shake. Move past this. Resolve it. Be okay again. What Claire had hoped for instead was something softer, something slower. A moment where Daniel would sit beside the feeling instead of guiding her away from it. Where he might say, "That sounds painful. Tell me more. Why does it hurt you that way?" But Daniel rarely asked those kinds of questions. Not because he didn't care. Claire could see that he cared. The concern in his eyes was real. Yet somehow, his kindness always stayed slightly above the surface of her emotions. Like warm sunlight touching the water, without ever diving beneath it. And the strange thing was, Daniel seemed completely comfortable there. In his world, kindness meant protecting someone from discomfort. In Claire's world, closeness meant being willing to sit inside that discomfort together. Neither one was wrong. But they were not the same language. And slowly, Claire began to understand that love spoken in different emotional languages can create a quiet loneliness. Because when one person reaches for depth, and the other offers safety instead, both believe they are giving love. Yet somehow, neither feels fully received. Claire never doubted Daniel's intentions. She doubted something far more unsettling. Whether two people could care deeply for each other, and still remain strangers in the places that mattered most. 6. The night she needed him most. It happened on a night that didn't look extraordinary at first. There were no storms outside the window. No dramatic argument leading up to it. No warning that this would become the moment Claire remembered long after everything else faded. The day had simply been heavy. One of those quiet, exhausting days where small disappointments stack on top of each other until even breathing feels harder than it should. Claire had spent the entire afternoon pretending she was fine. At work, she smiled when colleagues spoke to her. She answered emails. She nodded through meetings. But beneath the calm surface, something inside her was unraveling. By the time evening arrived, the weight of the day had settled into her chest like a slow ache. Not panic. Not even anger. Just a deep, lonely tiredness. The kind that makes you want one simple thing. Someone to sit beside you and say, "I'm here." Daniel was the first person she thought of. He had always been the steady one. The reasonable one. The person who seemed to know how to make difficult things feel manageable. So Claire called him. Not dramatically. Not in tears. Just quietly. When Daniel answered, his voice sounded calm as always. "Hey," he said. And for a moment, Claire felt the tension inside her soften. She didn't immediately explain everything. She simply told him that the day had been harder than usual. That she felt strangely overwhelmed. That she didn't really know why. There was a small pause on the other end of the line. Not a long one. Just long enough for Claire to hope that Daniel might hear something deeper in her voice. Something she couldn't fully say out loud. When he spoke again, his tone was gentle, but distant in a way she had begun to recognize. "You've had stressful days before," he said. "You'll get through this one too." Claire closed her eyes for a moment. The words were kind, supportive, but they felt strangely far away from the place where she actually was. She tried again, softer this time. I just wish you were here tonight. There was another pause. Longer now. Claire could almost picture Daniel thinking through his response. Finally he said, carefully, I can't come tonight, I'm still at the office. The sentence itself wasn't harsh. It was reasonable. Even expected. But something about the way it landed made the quiet room around Claire feel even emptier. She hadn't been asking him to solve anything. She hadn't even asked him to fix the day. All she had wanted was the feeling that someone understood the weight she was carrying. Daniel continued speaking, offering solutions, suggesting that she get some rest, reminding her that tomorrow would probably look better. And Claire listened. She thanked him. She told him she appreciated it. But as the call ended and the silence of the apartment returned, Claire realized something she had never fully admitted before. Daniel had cared. He had tried to help. But somehow, on the night she needed him most, she had still been alone. 7, trying harder to be loved. After that night, Claire didn't confront Daniel. Not because she wasn't hurt, but because the pain she felt didn't seem large enough to justify a confrontation. Nothing dramatic had happened. Daniel had been polite, reasonable, supportive in the way people are taught to be supportive. If she tried to explain her disappointment out loud, it might sound unfair. So instead of questioning the relationship, Claire questioned herself. Maybe she had been expecting too much. Maybe the quiet emptiness she felt had nothing to do with Daniel at all. Maybe love simply required patience and maturity. So she decided to try something different. She would become easier to love. It began in small ways. Claire stopped bringing up the heavier thoughts that sometimes surfaced late at night. When she felt overwhelmed, she told herself to process it alone first. By the time she spoke to Daniel, the emotion had already been softened into something manageable. She told herself this was healthier, more independent, more adult. When Daniel asked how her day had been, Claire learned to choose the lighter parts. A funny moment at work. A random observation from the street. A story that would make him smile. And Daniel did smile. The conversations became smoother, easier, less complicated. From the outside, their relationship seemed to grow calmer, more harmonious. But inside Claire, something subtle was shifting. She began measuring her emotions before sharing them, filtering them, editing them into versions that would fit more comfortably inside Daniel's world. The goal was simple. If she made her emotional needs smaller, maybe the distance between them would disappear. At first, this strategy seemed to work. Daniel appeared more relaxed, more present. He laughed more often. He complimented her warmth. He even said once, almost casually, "I like how easy things feel with you." Claire smiled when he said it. But later that night, the sentence returned to her in a quieter way. Easy. The word echoed in her mind. Easy meant there were no difficult emotions. Easy meant there were no long conversations about loneliness. Easy meant nothing heavy enough to disrupt the calm space Daniel preferred. And Claire realized something that made her chest tighten. The more she tried to become easier to love, the more invisible parts of her own heart were becoming. She was still there beside him. Still laughing. Still talking. Still building the life they shared. But the deeper pieces of herself, the ones that had once reached toward Daniel hoping to be seen, were slowly stepping back. Not in anger. Not in protest. Just quietly. As if they had begun to understand something Claire herself was only starting to see. That sometimes, when you try harder and harder to be loved, you slowly disappear from the love you are trying to protect. 8. The conversation that went nowhere. For a long time, Claire avoided the conversation. Not because she didn't want answers, but because she feared what might happen if the answers finally arrived. Still, there comes a moment in every quiet tension when silence becomes heavier than words. One evening, after dinner, the apartment felt unusually still. Daniel was sitting across from her, reading something on his phone. The soft light from the lamp filled the room with a calm that almost looked peaceful. Claire watched him for a moment. There was nothing wrong with the scene. No argument waiting to explode. No visible distance between them. And yet the same quiet pressure returned to her chest. The feeling that something important had been left unsaid for too long. So she spoke. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel looked up immediately. "Of course." His tone was relaxed, curious even. Claire hesitated for a second, not because the question was complicated, but because she knew it mattered. "Do you ever feel like we're not really connecting?" Daniel frowned slightly, not in anger, but in confusion. "What do you mean?" Claire searched for the right words. Not accusations. Not blame. Just honesty. "I don't mean we fight," she said softly. "I just mean, sometimes I feel like I'm reaching for you. And you're not really there." Daniel leaned back in his chair. He didn't react defensively. In fact, he seemed thoughtful. For a moment Claire felt a small spark of hope. Maybe this was the moment they would finally understand each other. But when Daniel spoke, his voice carried the same calm certainty she had heard so many times before. "I think you're overthinking things." The words were gentle, almost reassuring, but they landed with a quiet finality. Claire blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "I'm not trying to create a problem," she said carefully. "I just want to understand why I feel this way sometimes." Daniel nodded. And then he explained. He talked about stress. About how relationships naturally settle into calmer patterns over time. About how not every feeling needs to be analyzed so deeply. Everything he said sounded logical, balanced, even wise. Yet something inside Claire slowly sank as he spoke. Because she realized that Daniel wasn't truly hearing the question. He was solving it. He wasn't stepping into the emotional space she had opened. He was gently closing it. By the time the conversation ended, nothing had exploded. No voices were raised. No harsh words had been spoken. From the outside, it would have looked like a calm, mature discussion. But Claire felt something quietly collapse inside her. Not her love. Not her patience. Something more fragile than that. The belief that if she explained herself clearly enough, Daniel might one day understand what she was trying to reach. 9. The slow emotional shutdown. After that conversation, nothing dramatic changed. There was no breakup. No long silence between them. No moment where either of them declared that something was wrong. Life simply continued. Daniel still called in the mornings. They still shared dinners. They still laughed at the same small things that had once brought them closer together. From the outside, their relationship looked almost identical to what it had always been. But something subtle inside Claire had shifted. Not loudly. Not suddenly. Just enough to change the way she moved through the emotional space between them. She stopped reaching first. It wasn't a decision she consciously made. It happened gradually, like a habit fading away. When something interesting happened during her day, Claire sometimes paused before telling Daniel. She would hold the thought for a moment, then quietly let it pass. Not because she believed he wouldn't listen, but because she had begun to expect the same familiar distance in his response. And that expectation changed the way her heart behaved. The deeper parts of her emotions began to stay private. The questions she once asked late at night slowly disappeared. The vulnerable stories that once felt important suddenly seemed unnecessary to share. Daniel noticed some of the changes, but he interpreted them differently. To him, Claire seemed calmer, more independent, less weighed down by emotional concerns. And in some ways, that felt like progress. Their days became smoother, more efficient, more predictable. There were fewer complicated conversations, fewer moments of emotional intensity. Daniel appreciated that. He believed they had reached a kind of balance. What he didn't realize was that the quiet balance he felt had been created by Claire slowly withdrawing parts of herself. Not out of anger. Not out of punishment. But out of exhaustion. Because each time she had reached for connection and found only polite understanding, a small piece of her emotional energy had been spent. Eventually, she stopped asking for something she no longer believed she would receive. And when that happens in a relationship, the change rarely appears dramatic. It looks peaceful, stable, almost comfortable. But beneath that calm surface, something essential begins to disappear. Claire still loved Daniel. That part had not changed. What was changing was something more fragile than love itself. The instinct to share her inner world with him. And once that instinct begins to fade, something very quiet begins to take its place. Not anger. Not resentment. Just distance. The kind that grows slowly enough that neither person notices it forming. Until one day they realize they have been living beside each other, instead of truly being together. 10. The moment she stopped reaching. It didn't happen in one dramatic moment. There was no final argument. No tears on the kitchen floor. No sentence sharp enough to divide life into before and after. That was what made it so easy to miss. The moment Claire stopped reaching did not look like surrender. It looked like peace. At least from the outside. She still answered Daniel with softness. Still smiled when he kissed her goodbye. Still listened when he talked about work, about deadlines, about the people in his world. Nothing in her behavior seemed cold. Nothing seemed broken. And yet something essential had quietly changed. Claire no longer turned toward Daniel first when something moved her. When she saw something beautiful, she noticed it alone. When a memory surfaced unexpectedly and left a small ache in her chest, she carried it by herself. When fear, sadness, or tenderness rose inside her, her first instinct was no longer to share it. It was to contain it. At first, even she didn't fully understand what was happening. She told herself she was growing stronger, more self-contained, less dependent on being emotionally met. But deep down, another truth was beginning to form. She was not becoming less needy. She was becoming less hopeful. And there is a difference. Need softens when it feels safe. Hope disappears when it has been quietly unanswered for too long. Claire didn't stop reaching because she no longer loved Daniel. She stopped because love had started to feel like speaking into a room that gave no echo back. Not rejection. Not cruelty. Just absence. A space where her feelings could enter, but never fully land. So slowly, almost invisibly, she adapted. She began finishing emotional sentences in her own head. Comforting herself before he could misunderstand. Talking herself down before disappointment had the chance to bloom. Daniel noticed the calm. He noticed that Claire asked less of him now. There were fewer late-night questions. Fewer moments where she searched his face for something unspoken. To him, it may have looked like trust. Like maturity. Like the relationship had finally settled into something easier. What he did not see was that Claire had not found peace inside the connection. She had simply stopped trying to force one where none seemed willing to grow. And maybe that is the saddest turning point in any love story. Not when someone leaves. Not when someone lies. Not even when someone says goodbye. But when one heart quietly decides, I will stop knocking on this door. Because by then, the grief has already begun. Not the grief of losing a person entirely. The grief of realizing that somewhere along the way, you stopped believing you could still be found by them. 11. The pattern revealed. For a long time, Claire believed the distance between them was something she had somehow created. Maybe she had expected too much. Maybe she had misunderstood Daniel's way of loving. Maybe the quiet loneliness she felt was simply the natural evolution of a relationship settling into routine. Those thoughts followed her for weeks. Sometimes they appeared late at night, when the apartment was silent and Daniel had already fallen asleep. Other times they surfaced in small moments during the day, when Claire caught herself holding back something she once would have shared without hesitation. At first, she tried to ignore the pattern. But the human mind has a way of searching for meaning when the heart feels confused. One evening, almost by accident, Claire came across an article about emotional availability. She wasn't looking for answers. She had only been scrolling through something light, something ordinary, trying to quiet the restless thoughts that had been circling her mind. But a few sentences stopped her. They described a kind of relationship where one partner appeared caring, responsible, even loving, yet somehow remained emotionally distant. A partner who offered stability, solutions, and kindness, but rarely allowed their deeper feelings to be seen. Claire read the paragraph twice. Then a third time. The words felt strangely familiar. Not because they accused Daniel of anything cruel, but because they described something she had been feeling for months, without ever knowing how to name it. Emotional distance that hides behind reliability. Care that exists without vulnerability. Connection that functions smoothly on the surface, while something deeper remains untouched. Claire felt a quiet shift inside her chest. Not anger. Not blame. Something closer to recognition. For the first time, she began to see their relationship not as a series of confusing moments, but as a pattern. Daniel was not intentionally withholding love. In many ways, he believed he was loving her well. He showed up. He solved problems. He avoided conflict. But emotional closeness required something he rarely offered. The willingness to step into uncertainty. The willingness to let another person see the unpolished parts of his inner world. And suddenly, many memories rearranged themselves in Claire's mind. The calm answers that ended emotional conversations. The kindness that never quite turned into vulnerability. The steady presence that somehow never became true emotional intimacy. It had never been one moment. It had been a pattern all along. A pattern that looked gentle enough to ignore. Until she finally understood what it meant. Because once a pattern becomes visible, something inside you begins to change. You stop blaming every emotion on your own sensitivity. You stop trying endlessly to adjust yourself into someone easier to understand. Instead, you begin to ask a different question. Not what is wrong with me, but something far quieter and far more unsettling. What if this is simply the way he knows how to love? And if that is true, then the distance Claire had been feeling was not a misunderstanding. It was the shape of the relationship itself. 12. The childhood he never talked about. Claire never heard Daniel tell long stories about his childhood. Not the way some people do, half laughing through old memories. Naming favorite places, repeating family phrases that still lived inside them years later. With Daniel, the past existed in fragments. Small facts. Brief answers. A few carefully chosen details that revealed just enough to move the conversation along. But never enough to invite anyone deeper. If Claire asked about his parents, he would say they were fine. If she asked what home had been like, he would call it structured. If she asked whether they were close, Daniel usually gave the same calm response. They did their best. It was never hostile. Never bitter. And maybe that was part of what made it harder to notice. There are people whose pain arrives loudly. You can hear it in their anger, in their blame, in the way old wounds still leak into the present. Daniel was not like that. His pain, if it existed at all, had been pressed flat, organized, filed away into something that no longer sounded like pain. But Claire began to sense that what Daniel didn't say mattered more than what he did. Sometimes, when families came up in conversation, a subtle shift passed through him. Not enough for most people to catch. Just a stillness. A tightening so slight it could have been mistaken for composure. She noticed it when someone talked about childhood comfort, about feeling safe enough to cry, about being held, reassured, emotionally understood. Daniel never interrupted those conversations. He simply went quiet in a very specific way. As if he knew the language being spoken. But not from the inside. And once Claire began seeing that, other things started to make sense. Maybe Daniel had grown up in a home where emotions were managed, not explored. A home where being upset was something to control quickly. A home where love showed up as responsibility, discipline, and provision, but not necessarily as emotional presence. Maybe nobody had asked him, "What are you really feeling?" Maybe nobody had stayed in the room long enough to hear the answer if they had. If that was true, then Daniel hadn't learned to close himself by accident. He had learned it early. Learned that calmness was safer than need. That composure was more acceptable than confusion. That love meant showing up reliably, not revealing yourself vulnerably. And suddenly Claire felt a different kind of sadness. Not the sadness of being unseen. The sadness of realizing that Daniel might never have been deeply seen either. That somewhere inside the man who always had the right words, there may have once been a boy who learned very young that his inner world was something to contain, not share. It did not excuse the distance between them. It did not remove the loneliness Claire had carried for so long. But it gave the loneliness a history, a shape, a beginning that did not start with her. And that mattered. Because sometimes understanding where a wound began doesn't heal it, but it changes the way you hold it. 13. The question that changed everything. For a long time, Claire believed the most important question in her relationship was about Daniel. Why he stayed emotionally distant. Why his kindness never quite became closeness. Why the space between them always seemed to return, no matter how gently she tried to cross it. She had spent months studying those questions in quiet ways, watching his expressions, replaying conversations, trying to understand what hidden rule of love she might have misunderstood. But one night, a different question appeared. Not about Daniel. About herself. It arrived quietly, while she was walking home after a long day. The city lights reflecting across the pavement like scattered pieces of glass. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No music. No sudden realization that split the world in two. Just a thought that rose slowly to the surface of her mind. What am I actually waiting for? Claire stopped walking for a second. The question felt simple, almost harmless. But as she stood there, she realized something unsettling. For months, maybe longer, she had been waiting. Waiting for Daniel to open up. Waiting for a deeper conversation. Waiting for a moment when the distance between them would dissolve naturally. And while she waited, she had been quietly adjusting herself. Making her needs smaller. Her expectations softer. Her emotional world more contained. At first she believed this was patience. The kind of patience that strong relationships required. But now another possibility appeared. What if patience and postponement were not the same thing? What if waiting had slowly become a way of avoiding a harder truth? Claire continued walking, but the question stayed with her. Not loudly. Just steady. Like a quiet voice refusing to disappear. What am I actually waiting for? Because if Daniel had not changed after all the careful conversations, the gentle hints, the silent adjustments, what exactly was she expecting the future to do differently? The thought did not make her angry. In fact, the feeling was strangely calm. Almost clear. For the first time, Claire realized that the most important decision in her life might not depend on Daniel at all. It depended on whether she could answer a single question honestly. Not whether Daniel loved her. Not whether he meant well. But whether the love that existed between them was something her heart could truly live inside. And once that question appeared, something inside her shifted. Because some questions do not demand an immediate answer. They simply change the way you see everything that comes after. 14. Choosing herself for the first time. For most of her life, Claire had believed love meant endurance. Staying patient. Staying understanding. Staying gentle even when things felt uncertain. It was a quiet philosophy she had carried into every relationship. If something felt fragile, she protected it. If someone seemed distant, she gave them space. If love required sacrifice, she believed that sacrifice was simply part of commitment. And for a long time, That belief felt noble. But the question she had asked herself days earlier kept returning. Not loudly. Just steadily. What am I actually waiting for? The more Claire sat with that thought, the more another realization began to unfold. She had spent months trying to understand Daniel. Studying his silences. Explaining his distance in ways that felt compassionate. But she had rarely asked herself a different question. What did she actually need in order to feel loved? Not appreciated. Not respected. Loved. It sounded simple. But when Claire tried to answer it honestly, the answer surprised her. She didn't need dramatic gestures. She didn't need constant attention. What she needed was something quieter, but deeper. She needed emotional presence. Someone willing to stay in a difficult feeling instead of explaining it away. Someone who would listen not just to solve a problem, but to understand the person experiencing it. Someone who saw emotional closeness not as a complication, but as the very heart of love. And once Claire named that need clearly, something inside her settled. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough to give her a sense of direction she hadn't felt in a long time. One evening, she spoke to Daniel again. Not with accusation. Not with anger. Her voice was calm. I think I've been trying to adapt to something that doesn't really fit my heart, she said quietly. Daniel looked at her with the same composed expression he always carried. Claire continued, choosing her words carefully. I don't think you've done anything wrong. But I'm starting to understand that the way I experience love might be different from the way you do. The room stayed quiet. Daniel listened. Claire wasn't asking him to change. For the first time, she realized that was not the point. This moment wasn't about fixing Daniel. It was about recognizing herself. About admitting that the loneliness she had felt wasn't weakness or imagination. It was information. A signal from her heart telling her what kind of connection it needed. And for the first time, Claire allowed herself to treat that signal with respect. Not as something inconvenient. Not as something to silence. But as something worth listening to. Because sometimes the most important choice in a relationship is not choosing between two people. It is choosing whether you will remain loyal to your own emotional truth. 15. The silence that finally spoke. After that conversation, Claire did something Daniel had never seen her do before. She stopped explaining herself. Not in anger. Not to punish him. Not as some dramatic attempt to make him suddenly understand what words had failed to do. She simply became quiet in a different way. Before, her silence had been full of effort. It carried longing. Questions. A quiet hope that if she stayed patient enough, gentle enough, easy enough, something inside Daniel might eventually open. But now the silence felt different. It was no longer waiting. It was no longer reaching across the distance between them, trying to build a bridge alone. It was stillness. And somehow, that stillness said more than all the careful conversations Claire had tried to have before. Daniel noticed it almost immediately. Not because Claire became cold. She didn't. She was still kind. Still attentive. Still present in the ordinary rhythms of their life. But something essential had changed. The searching was gone. That subtle emotional leaning he had always felt from her, the unspoken invitation to come closer, had disappeared. Claire no longer looked at him as though she was hoping to be met somewhere deeper. She simply looked at him as he was. And there was something in that calm acceptance that unsettled him. For the first time, Daniel began to feel the absence of something he had never fully valued while it was there. It wasn't drama he noticed. It was the loss of emotional gravity. The relationship no longer bent quietly around his distance. Claire was no longer adjusting herself to keep the connection alive. And because she had stopped reaching, Daniel could finally feel how much of the reaching had always been hers. That realization did not come to him all at once. It arrived in flashes. In the pause after he shared something from work and Claire simply nodded. Instead of trying to turn the moment into connection. In the evening quiet, when she sat beside him peacefully, but not toward him. In the strange emptiness he felt when nothing was wrong. And yet something no longer felt the same. Daniel had spent so long believing that calm meant everything was fine. Now, for the first time, calm felt like distance. Not imposed. Not dramatic. Just real. And perhaps that is what silence does when words have been exhausted. It stops asking. It stops persuading. It stops translating pain into something easier for the other person to hold. And in doing so, it becomes impossible to ignore. Claire's silence was not revenge. It was truth, finally resting. The truth that love cannot survive forever on one person's emotional labor. The truth that being understanding is not the same as being met. The truth that a heart can grow tired of knocking, even if the door was never slammed. Daniel could feel that truth now, though he could not yet fully name it. All he knew was that Claire had become quieter. And somehow, her quiet now spoke louder than anything she had ever said. 16, when love finally meant presence. By the end, Claire no longer needed a perfect answer. She no longer needed Daniel to explain every silence, every distance, every moment that had left her feeling alone beside someone who claimed to care. Somewhere along the way, the question inside her had changed. It was no longer, why can't he love me the way I need? It had become something quieter, stronger, more honest. What does love actually feel like when it is real? And for the first time, Claire stopped measuring love by words. Not because words didn't matter. They did. But she had learned that words, by themselves, can become a beautiful illusion. They can sound like safety. They can sound like devotion. They can even sound like forever. And still, leave a heart starving. What Claire finally understood was this. Love is not proven by how often someone says the right thing. It is revealed by whether their presence makes you feel less alone inside your own life. Real love does not always arrive loudly. It does not need grand performances. It does not have to be dramatic to be true. Sometimes, real love is quiet. But it is not absent. It stays. It listens. It does not rush to fix what feels tender. It does not turn your pain into a problem that needs to be managed. It sits beside you long enough for your inner world to feel safe. That was the difference Claire had been trying to name all along. Daniel had offered care. He had offered steadiness. He had offered the kind of affection many people would have admired from the outside. But Claire had been longing for something deeper than admiration. She had been longing for presence. Not attention. Not control. Not emotional perfection. Just presence. The feeling that when she opened a door inside herself, someone would not simply stand at the entrance and say something kind. They would step in. They would remain. And they would not make her feel ashamed for needing to be met there. That realization did not make Claire bitter. If anything, it made her clearer. Because once you understand the difference between being loved in theory and being held in reality, you stop begging for crumbs that once felt like a feast. You stop mistaking emotional distance for maturity. You stop calling loneliness by softer names just to make a relationship easier to survive. And maybe that is one of the hardest truths about love. Sometimes the person who means well still cannot meet you where your heart lives. And sometimes healing begins, not when they finally change, but when you stop abandoning yourself while waiting. If this story touched something quiet in you, if you have ever felt alone beside someone who said they loved you, then maybe this wasn't just a story. Maybe it was a mirror. If so, share this video with someone who may need these words tonight. And in the comments, tell me this. Have you ever been loved in words, but not in presence? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast, and stay with us for more stories about love, loss, silence, and the truths people rarely know how to name. Because sometimes, the most life-changing thing you can hear is the truth you have been feeling all along.